Hello citizens and welcome back. In today's video I want to talk about the contested zones in Pyro and how they fit or don't fit into the grand scheme of Star Citizen. As always, if you like this video, sacrifice a like and a comment to the YouTube algorithm and subscribe for more. And here's a shout out to our amazing patrons for their support of the channel and the Armory. Over the last few weeks, CIG have shown us a new feature coming with the Pyro system in patch 4.0, the contested zones. The idea is pretty simple. A contested zone is an area occupied by NPCs, traps, and other traversal puzzles which contains valuable loot when you beat all the enemies and puzzles. Obviously, there is no armistice zone and there is a high incentive for PvP combat, and that's generally what contested zones are trying to achieve. They want players or groups of players to fight over control of strategic areas of the contested zone to gain valuable loot. The implication being that holding the strategic areas for a longer period will yield better rewards. So far, this actually sounds pretty good. A high-risk, fast-paced activity yielding valuable rewards for players willing to take the risk. The concept is somewhat similar to a few extraction shooters out there, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Extraction shooters are a very successful concept, and there is no reason it shouldn't work in Star Citizen as well. But the idea has some obvious and important issues that might prevent contested zones from getting the attention they deserve. And that also make me doubt if they are being implemented in a way that fits with the general themes of Star Citizen. The first problem reaches beyond the idea of contested zones, and fans of the channel will know that I'm talking about the loot system. And we talked about this a few weeks ago in a video. The loot system in Star Citizen has some major issues, specifically with what loot is available and how reliable the drops are. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend you go back and watch that video because it expands some of the concepts I'm going to talk about today. So there is a question of whether contested zones can contain loot that players want. And to answer that question, we need to figure out what players actually want. And that's difficult to figure out because every player wants something else. Currently, people loot to gain weapons that can't be purchased in Stanton, like sniper rifles or machine guns, but these weapons will be available in Pyro. There might be some rare armors instead, but I'm not sure if that's enough motivation for players to engage in dangerous combat. Now, CIG did mention that there might be some rare ship parts that you can find, which might be worthwhile in Pyro, where ship components might not be widely available. And on the channel, we also talked about adding physicalized currency into the loot generated in contested zones and everywhere else really. But what if loot isn't the reason players would want to engage in contested zones? Contested zones are about combat and action and working with or against other players, so the main incentive to participate is actually the combat and PvP gameplay. So maybe the loot is actually not that important. And I guess combat for the sake of combat fits with the general theme of Pyro, or at least some parts that CIG have shown us. And that's how we get to the other problem, which is the location. And this is actually way more important than loot. So take a step back and think about this. Star Citizen is a game about decisions, strategy, and preparation. It's also a game where nothing happens quickly and you need time to prepare, get to the location, and to do the task to get the reward. And that's where the problem is, at least initially. CIG said that the contested zones are part of the main space station in Pyro. In their own words, sometimes even only one airlock from common areas of the station, which I think is a problem for two reasons. First, this creates an environment of nearly instant action, which goes against what many players would consider the core concepts of Star Citizen and the general speed of gameplay in the game. Now, obviously there is action in Star Citizen, and it can be instant, but it is generally removed from common areas and spawn points. So technically nothing stops a player from just taking their undersuit and taking their chances and just running through the contested zone. And they could actually do this over and over with pretty much no delay, which doesn't seem very productive to me. but I see how it might appeal to a wider audience and even a part of the existing player base. But the close proximity of combat and common areas and spawn points is still a problem. Currently, armistice zones should prevent combat from spilling over into the populated areas, but you can bet that players will find some way to get around this restriction. One idea that comes to mind is having one person hold the airlock open while someone else is tossing grenades through. Now, this particular example can be mitigated with some structural changes to the gateway between the contested zone and the populated area. It might get a bit more complicated if CIG ever remove or soften armistice zones. Now, I don't think it will ever become a free-for-all with no armistice, but I definitely see a scenario where armistice is relaxed enough so that combat can spill over from the contested zone into a populated area. Now, in theory, station security forces should be able to contain such scenarios, but that's highly dependent on performance, so I am definitely interested in seeing how they solve this potential problem if they decide to go in this direction. Now, contested zones were included in the Pyro playtest. Well, kind of. Some of the areas of contested zones were used for combat missions, similar to the bunker clearing missions we see in Stanton. This raises two interesting questions. First, what is going to happen to these missions? I think CIG will want to keep them around. Missions add structure to gameplay, and they also add a dynamic aspect to the PvP and emergence side of contested zones. You could be venturing there for the loot, but encounter the mission NPCs, or they could spawn as you're making your way out. However, that brings us back to combat being readily available right next to a spawn point. So that brings us to the other question, which is, do CIG think this is a good design? Or are they just experimenting with faster paced gameplay? Because a common complaint we see is that getting to a mission or an area of interest takes too long, and if you die, it takes too long to get back in the action. But I believe that that's a part of the risk factor. So maybe CIG are trying to create a gameplay option close to the spawn point that negates the time it takes to get back into the action. And maybe the idea is that since loot is not very valuable, the reward is actually also lower because the action is less risky. I definitely see how that math works out on paper, but I'm not sure how players are going to react once it's in game. Now, I'm not saying it's wrong to have missions and activities available at spawn locations. That's actually a good thing. It gives players something to do while they're waiting for their ship to reclaim or for their friends to get there. But I would expect low risk, low reward activities, similar to what CIG outlined around the settlements in Pyro, activities like harvesting, deliveries, or repair. And finally, there is a bit of a lore aspect. I don't often talk about lore in Star Citizen because it doesn't always apply to what we see in the game. But this time, my understanding of the gang control stations is that they have quite a firm hold over their respective stations. So I would assume that security is pretty tight. Obviously, violence will happen because of the nature of the location. But I would expect the controlling gang to go investigate the endless firefights going on in that one part of the station, especially if there is valuable loot involved. You would expect them to lock down the location, take everything that's worth anything, and leave. So I guess it would be cool to see NPCs from the controlling faction spawn to interfere with the fighting going on, or perhaps bounty missions being issued for the players trying to occupy a contested zone. So in conclusion, there is a lot that CIG can do with contested zones. I for one am curious about this new direction of combat gameplay and the location of it. There are a lot of things that can go well, but also a lot of things that can go very wrong. So we will see what happens when 4.0 comes out. And with that being said, that's all for today. What do you think? Do you think contested zones make sense? Is this a good direction for combat gameplay? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, fly safe, and I will see you in the verse.